I thought I locked the door, but as I slipped off my blouse, I heard the creak of the handle. When I turned around, it wasn't a coworker or a client, it was Evan. The way he froze, his hand on the knob, and the look in his eyes, it changed everything. I should have been furious, but what I felt instead, I wasn't ready for it. I wasn't always the kind of woman who second-guessed herself, who felt like she was drifting without direction. In my 20s, I was a force to be reckoned with, confident, ambitious, the type of person who lit up a room just by walking into it. But at 52, that fire felt like a distant memory. My divorce wasn't dramatic or messy, but it was devastating in its own way. There were no screaming matches or betrayals, just the quiet realization that the man I had built my life with no longer saw me the way he once did. And I couldn't see him that way either. We parted amicably, dividing our lives like items on a checklist. He moved on quickly, dating someone half my age, while I poured myself into my career as a real estate agent. It wasn't my passion, but it gave me purpose. I was good at it, great even. My clients trusted me, my colleagues respected me, and I had a reputation for getting results. But when the day ended and the quiet of the night settled in, I couldn't ignore the loneliness that crept into every corner of my life. I tried to fill the emptiness with wine, books, and even a few half-hearted attempts at joining social groups. None of it worked. The loneliness was unrelenting, a constant companion I couldn't shake. On one particularly lonely night, after my second glass of wine, I downloaded Tinder. I told myself it was just curiosity. I wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Swiping through endless profiles, I couldn't help but feel disheartened. The men my age seemed tired and uninspired, and the younger ones, well, they were more interested in flexing than forming a connection. Then I saw him. Evan. His picture wasn't flashy, just him by a lake, smiling in a way that felt disarmingly genuine. His bio read, "Figuring life out one day at a time. Big fan of good conversations and bad pizza." It made me laugh. I almost swiped left out of habit. What could a 25-year-old and I possibly have in common? But something stopped me. Maybe it was the wine, maybe it was the way his picture made me feel alive. Before I could overthink it, I swiped right. It was a match. At first, it was just harmless fun, something to distract me from the monotony of my life. Evan's messages came daily, light and playful, filled with a charm that made me laugh in a way I hadn't in years. We talked about everything, his uncertain plans after college, my career in real estate, even our shared love of bad pizza. The age difference never came up, and I found myself letting my guard down. It felt easy, natural. But then came the shock. It was a Monday morning, and I was running late to the office, juggling my coffee and a pile of folders as I rushed into the team meeting. That's when I saw him, Evan, sitting casually at one of the desks. My stomach dropped. My colleague Cheryl, always eager to introduce new faces, beamed. "That's my nephew, Evan," she said proudly. "He's helping out for the summer." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Did he recognize me from Tinder? If he did, he didn't show it. He greeted me with the same easy smile I'd seen in his photos, polite and professional. I told myself it was a coincidence, a weird twist of fate, and nothing more. But as the days went on, it became clear this wasn't going to be simple. Cheryl assigned him to assist me on a few listings, which meant spending long hours together at open houses and client meetings. I tried to keep things professional, to put distance between us, but Evan made it almost impossible. There was something in the way he looked at me, the way his eyes lingered just a little too long during meetings, or how his smile would soften when our gazes met. It made my heart race, even as my brain screamed at me to stop. The turning point came late one evening. We were the last ones in the office, going over paperwork for an open house scheduled the next day. Around 8 p.m., Evan suggested ordering pizza, and we sat at my desk, laughing over slices of greasy pepperoni. The conversation was easy like always, but this time, there was something unspoken hanging in the air. A tension I couldn't ignore. At one point, I got up to grab something from the storage room. The summer heat had been brutal, and the office air conditioning wasn't working. Without thinking, I slipped off my blouse, leaving me in just my bra and slacks. It wasn't something I'd normally do, but the wine and exhaustion had me feeling unguarded. Then I heard it, the soft creak of the door opening behind me. I turned, my heart pounding, and there he was. Evan froze in the doorway, his face flushing crimson. For a moment, neither of us moved. I'm sorry," he stammered, backing out quickly and pulling the door shut. I stood there, clutching my blouse, my breath shallow. I should have been furious, at him, at myself, but instead all I could feel was a spark of something I hadn't felt in years. Excitement. Desire. And as much as I tried to push it down, to tell myself it was just the heat of the moment, I knew the truth. This wasn't just a passing crush. Something had shifted, and there was no going back. The next morning, I braced myself for awkwardness, for some kind of fallout. But Evan greeted me with the same polite, professional demeanor as always, like nothing had happened. Yet, every time our hands brushed as we worked or our eyes met across the office, that spark reignited. It was dangerous, intoxicating, and impossible to ignore. I told myself that what happened in the storage room was just an accident, a moment of poor judgment that would fade into the background. But as the days passed, it became clear that I was lying to myself. That spark between us wasn't going anywhere. It was growing, igniting into something I wasn't sure I could control. Evan never mentioned the incident directly, but there was a shift between us, subtle but undeniable. The air in the office felt heavier when we were alone, charged with an unspoken tension. He started finding excuses to linger, asking questions about properties he already knew the answers to or offering to help me with tasks he didn't need to. And then there were the glances, quick, fleeting looks when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Except I was. I noticed everything. It wasn't long before that tension came to a head. We were at an open house late one evening, tidying up after the last potential buyers had left. The sun had set, casting the suburban neighborhood in a soft golden glow. I was packing up marketing materials in the kitchen when I felt him behind me. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body. "You've been avoiding me," he said finally, his voice low. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. "I'm not avoiding you," I replied, though we both knew it was a lie. He stepped closer, his chest brushing against my back. "You are. And I get it. I know this isn't easy for you." I turned to face him, my breath hitching as I met his eyes. There was no judgment there, no frustration, just understanding. "Evan, this is complicated," I whispered. "I know," he said, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear. His touch was gentle, almost reverent. "But I can't stop thinking about you. About us." Before I could respond, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was soft, tentative, and filled with promise. For a moment, I hesitated, my mind screaming at me to stop. But then his hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and all my resistance melted away. The kiss deepened, years of suppressed desire flooding to the surface. That night changed everything. From that point on, our relationship became something I couldn't ignore. We started finding excuses to be alone together. Late nights at the office, long drives to showings, even stolen moments in the quiet corners of open houses. It was reckless, dangerous, and utterly intoxicating. One of our favorite spots became a little out-of-the-way cafe downtown, a quiet place where no one would recognize us. We'd sit in the back corner, sipping coffee and talking about everything and nothing. He told me about his dreams of traveling the world, the places he wanted to see, and the things he wanted to do. I told him about my daughter, about how proud I was of her, even though we didn't talk as much as we used to. Those moments were precious, a reminder that what we had wasn't just physical. It was more than that, deeper, more intimate. But with every stolen moment, the risks grew higher. The secrecy that had once been thrilling became suffocating. We had to be careful, so careful, constantly looking over our shoulders to make sure no one at the office suspected anything. Cheryl, always observant, seemed to notice the time we spent together. One afternoon, she pulled me aside in the break room, her tone casual but her gaze sharp. "You've been spending a lot of time with Evan," she said. "People might start to talk." I forced a laugh, brushing her comment off with a wave of my hand. "He's just eager to learn," I replied, hoping my voice sounded steadier than I felt. But her words stayed with me, a constant reminder of the fine line we were walking. The pressure came to a boiling point one weekend at a lake house we were preparing for a showing. The property was secluded, nestled in the woods with a deck overlooking the water. We arrived late in the afternoon to set everything up, the warm glow of the setting sun casting long shadows over the lake. "You should see the view from the deck," Evan said, his voice filled with quiet excitement. I followed him outside, the cool evening air a welcome relief from the heat of the day. The water shimmered under the fading light, the surface smooth and undisturbed. "It's beautiful," I said, leaning against the railing. "So are you," he replied, his voice soft. I turned to him, my heart skipping a beat at the intensity in his eyes. Before I could respond, he closed the distance between us, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that was slow and deliberate. His hands found the small of my back, pulling me closer as my body pressed against his. The deck became our sanctuary, the lake and the setting sun our only witnesses. Every time I told myself it would be the last time, but I knew better. The pull between us was too strong, the desire too consuming. And as much as I wanted to resist, I couldn't. I didn't want to. I had told myself we could keep it hidden, that no one would find out as long as we were careful. But secrets have a way of unraveling, no matter how tightly you try to hold them together. It started with whispers. A lingering glance from Cheryl, a knowing smirk from one of the younger agents, hushed conversations in the break room that fell silent when I walked in. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. But deep down I knew the truth. People were starting to notice. The breaking point came during a company dinner, a casual event to celebrate a successful quarter. The restaurant was loud with laughter and clinking glasses, the kind of atmosphere where it was easy to lose yourself in the crowd. Evan and I had been careful, sitting at opposite ends of the long table, avoiding any interactions that might raise suspicion. But even from across the room, I could feel his eyes on me, a silent pull that made it impossible to focus on anything else. As the night wore on, the tension became unbearable. I excused myself to the restroom, hoping a moment alone would help me clear my head. But when I stepped into the hallway, Evan was there waiting. "We can't keep doing this," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I know," he replied, stepping closer. "But that doesn't mean I'm ready to stop." His words were like a spark, igniting everything I had been trying to suppress. Before I could think, his lips were on mine, the kiss urgent and desperate. I wanted to push him away, to tell him we couldn't risk it, but instead, I pulled him closer, losing myself in the moment. We didn't realize Cheryl had followed me into the hallway until it was too late. The sound of her voice, sharp and incredulous, broke through the haze. "Claire?" I froze, my heart plummeting as I turned to face her. The look on her face said it all: shock, disbelief, and just a hint of something else. Disappointment? Betrayal? I couldn't be sure. "It's not what it looks like," I stammered, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. Cheryl didn't respond. She just turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding and my mind racing with the implications of what had just happened. The fallout was immediate. By the time I got to the office the next morning, the whispers had turned into full-blown gossip. Cheryl hadn't said anything directly, but the way she avoided my gaze spoke volumes. I tried to focus on work, but every glance, every quiet conversation between coworkers felt like it was about me. About us. Evan, for his part, seemed unbothered. If anything, he was more defiant, brushing off my concerns with a shrug. "Let them talk," he said one evening as we sat in my car after a late-night showing. "What do they know about us? About what this means?" But it wasn't that simple. The rumors were one thing, but the constant fear of being exposed, of losing everything I had worked so hard to rebuild, was something I couldn't ignore. And then there was Cheryl. She didn't confront me outright, but her silence was worse than any lecture could have been. I knew I had let her down, and that knowledge ate away at me, adding another layer of guilt to an already overwhelming situation. The final blow came a few weeks later. Evan and I had been assigned to prepare a listing outside the city, a secluded lake house surrounded by woods. It was the kind of property that practically sold itself, and we spent the day setting everything up for an upcoming open house. By the time we finished, the sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the lake. "You should see the view from the deck," Evan said, his voice filled with quiet excitement. I followed him outside, the cool evening air a welcome relief after the heat of the day. The water shimmered under the fading light, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. But that peace was short-lived. As we stood there, Evan turned to me, his expression serious. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice low. "About how this can't go on forever." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "Evan, He held up a hand, cutting me off. "Just let me finish. I don't regret any of this, Claire. Not a single moment. But I can't keep putting my life on hold. I've been offered a job in Seattle. It's not much, but it's a step in the right direction." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Seattle. 1,000 miles away. If he took the job, whatever this was, would be over. "When did this happen?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "A few weeks ago," he admitted. "I didn't want to tell you until I'd made up my mind." "And have you?" He hesitated, his gaze searching mine. "I don't know. Part of me wants to stay. For you. But another part of me knows I can't keep living like this. Tears welled in my eyes, but I blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. Evan, you have to do what's right for you, I said finally, my voice breaking. I don't want to be the reason you give up an opportunity. You're not just a reason, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. You're the reason. We stood there in silence, the weight of everything unsaid hanging heavy between us. And in that moment, I knew I had to let him go. Evan left for Seattle a week later. There were no grand gestures or tearful goodbyes, just a quiet understanding that this was how it had to end. On his last night in town, he came over to my house, and we spent the evening talking and laughing like we always did. When he kissed me goodbye, it was slow and tender, filled with everything we couldn't put into words. Then he was gone. The emptiness he left behind was suffocating. At work, the whispers faded, but the tension lingered. Cheryl's sharp gaze followed me wherever I went, though she never said anything outright. It was almost worse that way, the unspoken judgment hanging in the air. My once solid reputation felt fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. Nights were the hardest. Without Evan, the loneliness I had fought so hard to keep at bay came rushing back, stronger than ever. I tried to fill the void with work, throwing myself into listings and client meetings, but no matter how busy I kept myself, it wasn't enough. He was always there, in the back of my mind, a ghost of what we had, of what we'd lost. 6 weeks after he left, I got a postcard. It was from Seattle, a picture of the city's skyline with a short note scrawled on the back, "Thinking of you. Always, Evan." I held the card in my hands for what felt like hours, tracing the curve of his handwriting and letting the tears I'd been holding back finally fall. But as much as I missed him, I couldn't ignore the relief that came with his absence. The constant fear of being caught, the guilt that had gnawed at me every day, it was all gone. In its place was a different kind of pain, quieter but no less real. I had lost something, someone who had made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. Not a single moment. The office slowly returned to normal, though I knew things would never truly be the same. Cheryl began speaking to me again, though her tone was more reserved than it had been before. The younger agents seemed to lose interest in their gossip, turning their attention to the next bit of office drama. On the surface, it looked like everything had blown over. But deep down, I knew the damage was done. I began to rebuild piece by piece. I focused on my career, taking on more challenging clients and expanding my portfolio. I joined a new book club, one with women closer to my age, and started going to yoga classes on the weekends. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Slowly, I began to feel like myself again, or at least, a version of myself I could live with. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something that reminded me of Evan. A photo of the lake house where we'd kissed for the first time, a song he'd played for me in the car, and the memories would come rushing back. They weren't as sharp as they had been, softened by time and distance, but they still made my chest ache. I wondered if he thought about me as often as I thought about him, if he ever regretted leaving, or if he had moved on completely. One evening, months after he left, I found myself at the lake house again. It had been sold to a young family, and I was dropping off some paperwork for the closing. As I stood on the deck, staring out at the water, I felt the weight of everything we'd shared, and everything we'd lost. For the first time, I allowed myself to really feel it, not just the pain, but the joy, the excitement, the passion. It had been messy and complicated and imperfect, but it had also been real. I stayed there until the sun began to set, painting the lake in shades of gold and orange. As I drove home, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it. In the end, what Evan and I had wasn't meant to last. But it had reminded me of something I had forgotten, what it felt like to be alive, to be seen, to be desired. And for that, I would always be grateful. Time has a way of softening the edges of even the most intense memories. It's been 6 months since Evan left, and while the ache of his absence hasn't disappeared, it has settled into something quieter, more manageable. I don't think of him every day anymore, but when I do, it's with a bittersweet kind of fondness. What we shared wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and for that, I'm grateful. In the weeks after he left, I spent a lot of time reflecting. On us, on myself, on the choices I'd made. It wasn't easy to face the parts of myself I'd ignored for so long. The loneliness, the fear of getting older, the quiet desperation that had pushed me into his arms in the first place. But in facing them, I began to understand them, and in understanding them, I began to heal. Evan taught me something I hadn't realized I needed to learn. that it's okay to take risks, to want more, to crave connection even when it feels impossible. He reminded me of what it means to be alive, not just to exist, but to truly live, to feel deeply, even when it's messy and complicated. But he also taught me the importance of boundaries, of knowing when to let go. Holding on to him, onto us, would have been selfish. He had his whole life ahead of him, a future filled with opportunities one couldn't, and shouldn't, stand in the way of. Letting him go was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but it was also one of the most important. My life didn't magically fall into place after he left. There were still hard days, moments when the weight of everything felt like too much. But there were also good days, moments when I felt a spark of hope, a flicker of excitement about what might come next. I started going to therapy, something I'd put off for years, and it helped me unpack the feelings I'd buried for so long. Slowly, I began to rebuild. Not just my life, but myself. One day, as I was sorting through some old files, I came across a photo of the lake house. It was taken just before it sold, the water shimmering in the sunlight, the deck empty and serene. Looking at it, I felt a pang of longing, but also a sense of closure. That chapter of my life was over, and while it hadn't ended the way I might have hoped, it had left me stronger, more resilient, and more self-aware. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that life doesn't come with easy answers. The choices we make are rarely black and white, and sometimes the right decision doesn't feel right at all. But even in the messiness, there's beauty. Even in the pain, there's growth. Now, when I think about Evan, it's not with regret. Instead, I remember the way he made me laugh, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world, the way he reminded me of the woman I used to be, and the woman I could still become. He was a part of my journey, a stepping stone on the path to finding myself again. As I move forward, I carry the lessons he taught me, the memories we made, and the knowledge that I am capable of more than I ever realized. And while I don't know what the future holds, I do know this. I won't let fear hold me back. Life is too short to live in the shadows, too precious to let it slip by without truly living. If you were in Claire's shoes, what would you have done? Could you have walked away from the spark that reignited your soul? Or would you have risked it all for love? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story if it moved you. Stay tuned. Our next tale will take you on an even wilder emotional roller coaster. You won't want to miss it.